Hello everyone, welcome to UMD Media. Today we are back with a new topic. Those who are following us on YouTube, Facebook, please share, like and subscribe so that we have more viewers for our content. UMD Media starts now. Share, subscribe, like on every platform you can reach in terms of WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, and so on. Today, we are back with self-determination, past, present, and future. And my guest is Dr. Tsegaye Ararssa, and he is coming back to UMD Media. Last time we had a conversation in Amharic. So, Dr. Tsegaye, welcome back to UMD Media.
Thank you, Gitch. Thank you so much for having me. And I apologize to your audience for not appearing the last two times as scheduled. It was just an overlapping of commitments, and I apologize for that.
It's totally understandable. I mean, the significant time difference we have is, I know it's not easy to arrange this. So for those who haven't followed the guy, this is one channel you can reach him. This is the Twitter account at Ararssa, Ragasa Ararssa. That's his Twitter handle. On Facebook, he's there as well, active. And one thing that I did in the Amharic show, and I want our audience to understand where you come from in terms of not only academic, but the brain and heart. I see in this pledge the brain and the heart of a legal academic. And this is written in 2011, almost 10 years ago. Actually, next month, it will be 10 years since you wrote this. I mean, I highlighted some part here relevant to what we were discussing at that time and so on. But just, I would be glad, if you can share the background and the, what led you into writing this very, I mean, in my view, very important content.
Well, I think it's a muse. It's a reflection and a personal contemplation about what specifically my responsibility is as a legal academic in Ethiopia. As you know, I have been literally, I went to school at the moment when the Constitution was deliberated, and I graduated at the same time when the Constitution was inaugurated. I graduated in July. The Constitution was inaugurated in August 1995, and I became an academic. I worked as a prosecutor for I think 6 months. And then I became a law teacher, a young 21 years old law teacher, and teaching very unconventional sort of students, unconventional in the sense, students who did not come straight from high school, students who did not naturally graduate into college. These students were basically the people who laid the struggle of 17 years before 1991. And these people are people who have been in the struggle way before I was born, who have been in the 1960s student movement, people who have paid extraordinary sacrifice in order for them, in their view, to change the country and to create a better Ethiopia, better world. And they have their own vision, they have their commitment, they have their political discipline, they have their sacrifice and everything that has gone into what they do, and they know what they're talking about. And I'm a young man who was born at the time they went to the jungle, and I got no idea what these people are. And I teach, I wasn't told. And I started to teach a very innocent kind of subject, law of contracts, and then legal skills, and then criminal law. And gradually I became more and more involved in teaching public law areas. And of course, as a student, when we were at the law school, we were always talking about the Constitution, because there was this, it was really a constitutional moment. There was a transitional charter at the time, and there was the Constitution Deliberation on self-determination, and there was the Eritrean referendum while we were at school. Everything was debatable in the university setting at the time. And so we have grown up with it, with all these ideas going on. So naturally, because for the first time, also the country is opening up to the Western world. There are new literature coming from the Western world, because for the 17 years, we have literature coming only from the people's democracies of the East. And if you go to the law school, the large majority, the vast majority of the shelves in my time was from Hungary, GDR, German Democratic Republic, Soviet jurisprudence, Poland, Polish, Yugoslav, these kinds of literature. And there wasn't any literature on human rights, on rule of law, on constitutionalism as we know it in the West, and so on. Just when we stepped into the law school, the university started to teach human rights law for the first time. Constitutional law took on a different kind of verve within the academic community, because also the law school was created by American legal scholars in the 1960s. There was a rush from the West by those, all those Western professors were coming back to see how their law school has been for the last 17 years. They have brought all sorts of materials with them. Some of them were advising the government about the constitutional development in the country. For example, Jim Paul was there, and a host of others came just to see how the law school is doing. Because once you work in a law school as a founder, you look at it like your own child, and especially when you have been shut out from it for the last 17 years, you want to really look at how it has been, So they were all there, and they brought all sorts of networks, connections, books, materials, scholarships, scholars, funds, and everything. And they established the Human Rights and Peace Center as kind of an NGO, part of the law school, and as a part of the Human Rights and Peace Center, which Andreas Shetty was kind of convening, and I think Wubishet was a chair of. Ibrahim Idris was, I don't know what he was, but he was an official there. And they have these lectures from the West and so on. We have been part of that motion, we have this beautiful texts of the American Constitution, the UN Charter, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and all those documents. We haven't seen those kinds of documents, and they are being given for free because it was basically closed, and we didn't know, because when I was growing up in high school, the only library I had access to was the British Council Library, that's the West, after I was 11th grade, and the National Library. The National Library was shut off from the Western world for 17 years. So new books are just the feel and touch of new books, is itself something exciting. And so these new books arriving from the West and being given out to us for free from the ICRC and so on and so forth was just fascinating. So that's how we grew up. It wasn't in the classroom that we studied human rights and international law and constitutional law. It was from this movement. And then there was the Constitutional Assembly, the election for Constitutional Assembly, and the Human Rights Peace with an NGO called ADNET, conscripted us to be observers of the first election. And I had never participated in election at that time myself, but I was an observer. And I was an observer in some of the election spots in the city. And you just, by observing, you learn and take time to reflect on what the public life thing is about and how it has to evolve. Okay, having grown up in this way, little knowledge about the struggles that went on before 1974, and having only heard only propaganda, state propaganda about the TPLF, the OLF, the EPLF, etc. as separatists that are destroying the country, etc. We had no clue. And so I'm facing these people who have died and killed in the name of self-determination. It was the Civil Service College, and very prominent officials of the EPRDF from all walks of life, from all regions, were there. And as you know, today, as we speak, I think about 8 out of 10 presidents, regional presidents, are my former students. All of the Supreme Court justices, except the federal president and vice president, are my students, my former students. All of the attorney generals, including the federal attorney general, the mayor of Addis Ababa, all these people are my former students. And so these were the people I was teaching. And over time, in the feisty, youthful engagement with them, I come from a point of ignorance, but also from a point of criticism against them, as if they don't know a thing. I am educated in this. I know this new, Western type of thinking. And in that process, I began to really get down to hear them, get down to understand what is going on. And in the process of the engagement, when they realize that you are really an honest inquirer, they also make it available for you, make the resources available for you. The resources like the minutes of the Constitutional Assembly, official documents and communications, and all sorts of agreements, arguments, old writings about Eritrea, about Ethiopia, Tigray, the Oromo Liberation Front, the Ogaden, and so on and so forth. And you say, oh wow, this is huge. So across time, I began to be engaged with the issue of diversity. The one thing that Ethiopia is always wary of, Ethiopia is so concerned with, Ethiopia is always denying, Ethiopia is always trying to suppress. And by the time I was 27, I did my master's thesis on the matter, self-determination, as a constitutional legal solution for multinational polities. And then I began to teach exclusively constitutional law, international human rights law, and some such subjects. And after that, I began to teach in the Institute of Federalism and so on and so forth. Now, in 2008, 2009, for a long time, I was teaching in the graduate school. I had issues with the government. That country is a country that's not very transparent in its dealings with people. And of course, my teachings became very critical, my right too critical. It was perceived to be too critical. For me, it is basically the most orthodox kind of writing one can imagine to have. So I think in 2008, 2009, I wrote, I became very vocal just because I speak about some of the sensitive issues, such as the making and legitimacy of the Ethiopian constitution, human rights in the Bill of Rights, in the Ethiopian Bill of Rights, minority rights in Ethiopia, the issue of federalism and state constitutions. These are simply topics I teach at the university, and because there aren't too many resources, I have to write and publish some articles so that students will have them, will use them. And when I do that, some of the criticism were not very well taken. I'm not sure if the people at the top have actually read it and disagreed, but I think the low-level foot soldiers were unnerved, and they somehow wanted to eliminate me, wanted me to not be there, and I was accused of all sorts of crimes, like someone standing against the constitutional order and so on and so forth. And of course, it was all bogus. And usually it was the articles that were given as an evidence for that. And I was suspended from teaching. At first I was teaching, but I was denied payment. Then I was suspended from teaching. And at some point, I was actually prohibited from going both out of the country and across the country, especially to go and teach in a block. We used to do block teaching in the graduate schools the newly started graduate schools in the regional universities. And I was basically, through a circular, I was denied to move around. So I was basically at home. And while at home for about 11 months at some point, while at home, I was, you know, my young boy was just a little baby, and my wife was a judge. So I had full-time engagement with the little boy. And when he's asleep, I read everything that I find on the shelf. And I was reading a book, an anthology, actually. It's Norton's Anthology of Literature, I think, 7th edition or something. And as I was reading through some of the writings, you know, all sorts of 20s, I mean, all sorts of inspirational literature are in there. And I was reading some of the writings, such as the ones by Martin Luther King and all sorts of other people. And at some point, I was reading actually with a heavy heart of sorrow, because I couldn't do what I'm passionate about. I couldn't teach, and I don't know the future. Everywhere I go, I'm followed by security intelligence personnel. And, you know, you go out, you encounter someone who is following you. You come home, and you're alone, you read, and you don't know exactly what this reading amounts to. What you send to publishers is not published, you know, in journals. People fear you. So it's with that sense of disappointment, disenchantment, if you like, or sense of mourning, really, that I was in this contemplative mood. So what I did was, when I was reading some of the writings, I don't exactly remember which ones now, but as I was reading, when you feel inspired, sometimes you just write some notes. So I turned to the back page of the Norton's Anthology of Literature, and I wrote with pencil, I scribbled some of the thoughts that eventually became this piece, a pledge. And it kind of inspired me, the reading, to say, look, there is meaning to what you do. To stand for the truth and to speak truth to power is not valueless. And no matter what happens, no matter how you are threatened, to be able to speak the truth and live with your conscience, I said, is my responsibility. And I say I am an academic. I had been bragging to people, saying, look, I'm not doing this because you pay me. Even if you stop to pay me, even if you deny me any classroom, I will go and collect students under the tree and teach. That's how much I was so passionate about. And now suddenly it was a moment of contemplation. It was a moment of, is this what it all comes down to? So in that moment of reflection, I said, exactly what is my responsibility? And you see your own colleagues, you know, who point their fingers at you as a critical voice, as anti-government, etc., who are doing some other things. They literally stand in support of the regime or in support of ugly things. And sometimes I just wonder, was this not an apology for power? And should we, as intellectuals, isn't it our responsibility to be a little dispassionate, a little distanced from power, and to be able to imagine what academic freedom entitles us to imagine, and speak truth to power, speak, you know, at least humanize power by speaking reason to it and tame force. And that was a kind of reflection I was in, and I said it was part a contemplation, a mourning, part it is an accusation of your colleagues who are rushing to be apologists of power, a part it is an indictment on intellectuals who use their certificate, their qualification, only to qualification as a permission to empower politics of empire, repression, oppression, standing with the powerful as opposed to the victim of injustice, especially lawyers who were supposed to be custodians of justice, tended to be, at that time, to me, they tended to be either fearful or siding with the strong. And in fact, to do justice is not even about treating the powerful and the weak in the same way. In fact, it is siding with the weak and protecting the weak from the strong. And so it was an indictment on them too. There was also this, in those days, there was this complete hermeneutic anarchy, I call it, because law is mainly about interpretation. And some of us were co-opted in the name of a different interpretation. And so, because in Ethiopia also there is no rules of statutory interpretation, rules of legal interpretation, everyone makes it up as they go. What a particular legal provision means is subject to anyone's interpretation. It's not really, the profession is not that strong. There is no centralized rules of interpretation, rules of approaching texts. And it was just crazy. It's hermeneutical anarchy, I call it. And whenever there is some controversial issue, and when what the law says needs some illumination, you will find people who have completely, contradictory views about those particular. For example, can the ruling party suspend election and postpone it to another year? This was the question just last year. And you have all sorts of legal professionals coming from all over the world to give you their own version of interpretation. And there was no central professional language, if you like, with which to constrain these arbitrary interpretive projects. And you would see in there some of the draftspersons, the people who were involved in the drafting process, like Andreas Schette and some other big personalities, come and say, wait, this is not the way it is done. And all the technical PhD holder professionals were basically siding with the strong and saying it has to be postponed, our country is in danger, blah, blah, all sorts of things. So it is precisely that thing that was happening in 2008, 2009. I was very mad with that. How is it we read the same law and end up justifying different repressive measures taken by the regime? How is it, if we can't even support it, how can we not professionally distance ourselves from it? That was the question that I was struggling with. And so I said, no matter what, I am going to do this. By God's grace, I'm going to do this, and so on and so forth. So I wrote it in the back page of the Norton's Anthology of Literature, and I threw it away. I forgot. And then in 2010, I got employed in the United Nations. Whew, relief, because I couldn't work anywhere in the country's institutions. And I think the resident representative of the UNDP took risks to hire me. And I was working there, I'm always the academic, in-house academic there. I developed policy papers apart from doing the ordinary routine of democratic governance and human rights. So in that process, I had a colleague who was also my former student at the University Law School. Somehow she found that piece. She read the scribbles on the back page of the book, and she said, "This is nice, Why don't you write it?" And I said, "Oh, really?" And then, okay, I said, let me type it then. So as I typed it, it began to have a different shape. I mean, it sounded more like it's begun to take its own rhyme, its own pace. And I said, yeah, okay. So I wrote it and I just sent it to her, and that's it. And then as she read it, she said, I think this should be our pledge for all of us. And she said, why don't you publish it? Nah, it's not worth publishing, no. So in 2011, just before I departed, actually after I departed, just before I departed, just for the sake of sharing it as a friend, I sent it to Elias Noor, who is the editor-in-chief of Mizan Law Review, who is also at that time the dean of St. Mary's University Law School. And he saw it, and I said, I'm going to publish it in our Mizan if you don't mind. I said, is it of any significance at all? It's just a personal reflection, and it's a morning. At best, it could be a personal desiderata that you can write on your, or like you post on your refrigerator, so that you want to remind yourself about what you stand for. And he said, yeah, it's inspiring, you know. And so he took it to the last page of that issue of the journal, I think in the area entitled Reflections, and he published it there. I don't even remember exactly what it says, but I think I know the ethical gesture, I know the moral gesture of that piece. I know it's against politics of empire and politics of power, you know, all sorts of oppression, injustice, and siding with the powerful as opposed to the weak, and so on and so forth. But yeah, that was a long
Yeah.
time ago, almost a
Yeah.
generation ago now. Sorry.
No worries. I mean, the reason I want you to share this with our audience was what I highlighted here, which is pretty much very relevant to where we are now. So, as a legal academic, I have the duty to distance myself from the politics of hegemony and from the scholarship of power. You know, this is very powerful for me in terms of what we see now, and it's also a good segue for me. I mean, to make an ad on upcoming show, because you, in your talking about the evolution and background story of this pledge, you mentioned about professional ethics and how it's being abused for legitimizing, you know, a conclusion that's already done by the politician, by the government, and so on. So how this is being murdered. But I'm having a conversation on professional ethics and war, to drive war, and everything related to that, maybe in the past, how professionals, if any, behaved, you know, or conducted their duty professionally, and how that was also a problem, you know, when lawyers, medical doctors, physicians, natural scientists were using their professional career for advancing, you know, as worst as Holocaust, genocide, and so on. So I'll be talking with Mastoal Taddesa in Amharic on Saturday. So this is a good segue for this topic. And Dr. Tsegaye does publish not only in Mizan Law Review, where the pledge was published, and this is also, I have to come back with this maybe in another conversation with him. So this is very relevant as well, because we'll be talking about part of the constitution that's related to federalism, self-determination today. And I recommend people to read this from what I saw in the headings and so on. There is a lot to learn from. And another publication, again, related to constitutionalism at state level. This is from him as well. So with that background, you mentioned a bit about how you were feeling passionate about self-determination. I don't think everybody knows what is under self-determination, to what extent it can go, all that, because the topic is related to the current constitution. We'll come back to that. But if you know, you were to talk about briefly about self-determination, what it is, what it entails, what would that be?
Well, it's self-determination is the right of peoples to decide on their political, cultural, and economic destiny. I mean, in short, this is also what you find in all the international instruments, such as the UN Charter, Article 172, You have the UN Declaration on Colonized Peoples, 1960. You have the United Nations General Assembly Resolution of 1970 regarding friendly relations, and the ICCPR, the Common Article 1 of ICCPR and ICESCR. All of them talk about self-determination in terms of the right, in terms of it being the right of peoples to decide on their political, economic, and cultural destiny. What it basically means is, at least in its external form, there is an external self-determination and internal self-determination. At least in its external form, what it means is the right of people to form their own state. Basically, it's a high modernity nationalist project, to be honest. And it is no accident that the right of self-determination has been very much in public discourse only after 1918, after the end of the First World War, the Leninist version of self-determination from the East, the Wilsonian version of self-determination from the West. The socialist left intellectuals were for self-determination because they saw it as an instrument of dismantling empire and dismantling the bridge among peoples. They saw empire as contrary to proletarian internationalism. The bridge among various oppressed peoples was contained by the imperial politics, imperial hegemony, and self-determination helps to dismantle that imperial hegemony and dissolves the bridge and the conflict among brothers across the cultural, the linguistic, and territorial divide. So in order to make sure, make it possible for an international socialist movement to happen, they said oppressed peoples everywhere under imperial oppression should be let free. And in order to let them free, let them out of the imperial domination, and in order to build the brotherhood of the oppressed, then you have to have self-determination. And those people, once they determine their destiny, then they can hold hands with their brothers next door. Until that happens, we can't have a socialist internationalism. We can't have socialist brotherhood. So that was the Leninist structure, basically addressing the issue, speaking back to the First World War, because the First World War was an imperial war. It was a huge empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the newly established German Empire, against the British Empire, the French Empire, and of course, the Russian imperial regime. So it was basically speaking to that war and how imperial forces conscripted every oppressed folks for their imperial war, and to advance only. It was basically a war over colonial international ambitions. That's basically what it is. So in order to downsize these imperial forces and in order to free the people within the trappings of these empires, self-determination was found to be useful. So it's a very instrumentalist approach. So that was the Leninist version in his seminal work on the national question. And later, the nationalities question, again by Stalin, developed further. There is a bit of variation between the two, but basically that's the left. And there it was also Wilsonian 14 points in 1918. He spoke to the Congress in February, and he said people should determine, these trapped people in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, mainly in Ottoman Empire, these people need to decide their destiny. And for him, the only country at that time with a superpower, but not an empire yet, not a colony yet, was the United States. Because it is an experiment in democracy. They just have overcome the after effects of the Civil War. And these are, they were hesitant to intervene in the international arena. They had these isolationist policies. And he himself, Wilson himself, had been elected for the second time, promising that he will not be involved in the war. And yet he arrived there and he wanted to be a force for good. And he had this huge project of a peaceable kingdom across the globe. And one way of doing that is to free the people who are oppressed under the empires and also find allies in those places. Hence, the breaking up of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the establishment of the Czechoslovak countries, all sorts of countries, the Polish and all those things, and of course the entire Middle East under the suzerainty of the Turkey. That was the beginning of the idea of self-determination. It didn't stop there. It also established the mandate system. The mandate system basically says that it is a sacred trust of our civilization to help people who are not yet ready for statehood and to continue to rule them. So the idea of self-determination is basically the result of high modernity nationalism, which wants to equate people with the state. So it basically means the right of people to have their own state in its external aspect. In its internal aspect, it means the right of autonomy, the right to govern oneself, the right to enjoy your culture, your distinct culture and identity, and so on and so forth. Basically, that was what it was. After the Second World War, the right to self-determination continued to come up, but primarily now it was seen as a way of establishing peace among nations. It was basically something that will be used against warring countries. Self-determination became the right of states to be protected from rogue countries, like the Hitler, Mussolini type of National Socialists who wanted to make the world in their own way and who wanted to impose their own vision of internationalism. So it was against fascism. In terms of countering fascism, they said the right of states, the rights of peoples means by then the rights of states, basically, to have the right to territorial integrity and unity and so on and so forth. Primarily that was what it means. Article 1, sub 2, and then Article 55. And then soon they also realized, by 1950, they realized that colonial nations have to be set free. Of course, the mandate system now was replaced by the trusteeship system in the UN, and the trusteeship system has to let free all these people who have been under colonial oppression. So by 1960, the UN General Assembly made it into a law, and all colonized people became the subject of the right to self-determination. So what does it basically mean? It's in terms of in its external aspect, it means the right of people to form their own state. It means making sure that state and people are coterminous. It's basically nationalism in its full force. Okay, and then of course, in its internal form, it means about self-rule. It means about one's using of one's distinct identity, enjoyment of one's distinct culture, and so on and so forth. And does it include the right of minorities? Well, the rights of minorities coming to the picture in the form of self-rule, autonomy, and so on and so forth. But normally, in its external aspect, it's a one-off thing. It is the right of peoples to form a state. Once they form a state, the state is protected by international law. That was what it is. In constitutional law, the right of self-determination is first and foremost the right of the political community. So it means the right of the nation, the country, to have absolute sovereignty, which means exclusive jurisdiction over your territory and complete non-interference from any alien force. That's basically what it means. So the right of self-determination in constitutional law means the right of the peoples of a state to be protected from external interference and to be free to decide on how they are governed, the right to democracy. So, in fact, Wilsonian self-determination is about the right to democracy. So, in our constitution, as you know, it has a different story. And as you know, in Ethiopia, it is the most under-theorized and under-historicized subject. Maybe we'll come back to that point later. But it is the right of groups. It is a collective right. It's a collective right to form one's own polity, whether it's in the international, to be recognized in the international forum, or to be only governing itself within a federation of a sort. But at the end of the day, it all means creation of a state for a people, creation of a political community, that a self-governing political community for a people. So state administration and the people should be one and the same, coterminous. You know, it's the state and the nation must be coterminous. Now, there is a lot of criticism to be made about the urge to make the state and nation, you know, to stick together in a hyphenated form. We can criticize the nation-state form for various reasons, but self-determination is about creating a nation-state.
With that, I mean, I'm glad you give us a good picture of how it went, at least in Europe, during the after the First World War, all that. And you also briefly mentioned how the Ethiopian constitution and the relevant article, it didn't get the attention it needs in the in terms of the theory and history of it. I'm not going to claim that we are going to do that full-fledged here, but if we were to ask what place does or did, specifically in the past, have the urge for self-determination or the quest for self-determination within Ethiopia, is there any timeline we can speak of when it comes to Ethiopia? I mean, I usually in at least 3-4 shows, I showed this paper. This paper is from the 1980s, but it's talking about another graduate work, master's work in Belgium, done by Tadla Haile. This is 1930, that maybe a couple of years before Italian invasion of Ethiopia. So, is there any, I mean, in the academia or in Ethiopian history, where we can point to a period where the quest for self-determination was, you know, visible? I mean, we'll talk about Walelin, all that, the nationalist question, but I'm just wondering if there was any time this was a subject matter, because there are people who question, specifically in the elite politics of Ethiopia, that the 1995 constitution just imposed this article related to self-determination. Is that right? I think you are muted, or we have audio issue, I guess. Not yet. Now you are officially muted. I can see that, but let me see if I can unmute you. No, I don't know why, but we have audio issue. I can't hear you. Is it only me? Let me see what all the audience is hearing. No, I can't hear you. So maybe if you come, yes, that's good. In the meantime, I will do some advertisements here. So tomorrow we will have a postponed, rescheduled session, live interview with Ned Price. He's the spokesperson for the U.S. State Department, and we'll be talking about recent diplomatic efforts in Ethiopia. And Saturday, ጻንሒት ምስ ቅሳነት ሃይሌ ኣብ እንዳ ገብረ ህይወት ናይ ትግርኛ መደብ ኣለና። ላይቭ ምስ ቅሳነት ሃይሌ ክህልወና እዩ። ቅዳሜ አሁንም ከማስተዋል ታደሰ የህግ ባለሙያ ነች። የሙያ ስነ ምግባር ፕሮፌሽናል ኤቲክስ እና የትግራይ ጦርነት በሙያቸው ስነ ምግባር ይሰሩ የነበሩ ኢትዮጵያውያን ካሉ ወደኋላ ሄደን አይተን ለምን ያጠፋ በዓለምስ ታሪክ ምን ይመስላል የዛ የመጥፋት ሚና ብለን በተለይ ከህግ ባለሙያዎች አንጻር እንመለከታለን። እስቲ let me see if Dr. Tsegaye. Yes, now I can hear you.
Yeah. So was there a timeline for the development of the recognition of the right to self-determination in Ethiopia? Yes, obviously, in terms of explicit articulation, it started during the student movement in the 1960s with the coming into the picture of Ethiopian modernity. But so the Walaling and what follows after that, and the different parties and the revolution, and then of course 1991 is the climactic point at which it was articulated in a very powerful and legal manner. But was the itching there? Was it necessary? Is it just a something that is imposed by some elite from above for problems that did not exist, as sometimes it is claimed in the contemporary political discourse? I disagree, because that denies the fact that the country was a multinational empire. The country that was established at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, Ethiopia, was basically a multinational empire. And the people who basically say the self-determination issue, the federalism issue, is an artifact of the TPLF and the OLF or the student movement, basically deny even the multinational nature of the polity even today. But we all know that it was a multinational empire, and the constitutions of 1931, 1955 looked at the country and described the country as an empire. Of course, multiplicity and multinationality in Ethiopia is a lived fact, but it's a denied norm. It's a lived fact. Everybody knows that 5 kilometers away from the Finfinne town, there are different languages that come your way, and different cultures, different histories that come your way. So it was the idea of multinational diversity, ethnicity generally, is a lived reality. It is a lived fact, but a denied norm in terms of turning it into politically meaningful as a source of the self of the different people in that country is denied. So, but because precisely, and there is a reason for the denial. The denial is because they want to resolve this tension between it being a multinational empire and its aspiration to become one nation state. So Ethiopia was trying to create a nation state out of a multinational empire. And when it wants to create a nation state, first, they should bring the people into oneness, constructed oneness. And then, of course, claim the state for the one people. And that's why in all the slogans, Ethiopia wills against the forces of diversity, including today under Abiy. They talk about one people, one nation. That kind of mantra goes on. The reason is they had embarked, the old imperial leaders had embarked on creating a nation state out of a multinational empire. And that was intended to be done through extermination if possible, and that's why it tends to be genocidal, the Ethiopian state, or assimilation, or some form of co-optation. These are some form of co-optation of the elite, or assimilation into what Teshale Tibabu calls the Tabot culture, or outright extermination. And Ethiopia's state is fundamentally genocidal because it attacks those which are the others of the state. It is ingrained in it. That's why it's not certain that it comes out even today. And it comes out with a very brutal effect because it is part of the constitutive grain of that polity. And it's no wonder that the person you just showed, whose name you just showed in an article written some years ago, Tadla Haile, in 1932, he wrote a thesis about how the Ethiopian Empire failed to assimilate the different ethnic groups in Ethiopia. And in fact, he particularly talks about how Ethiopia failed to assimilate, why Ethiopia failed to assimilate the Oromo. And he lays out the policies, the options they have. One is extermination, the other is assimilation. And he just lays out the different formulas that have to be taken, and he refers to different other countries' colonial exercises, like the indirect rule of the British, the direct rule of the French, and he says, why is it our country failed to create a nation state out of the many? And this guy later came to Ethiopia to be an advisor, and his policy was taken, and he actually, extermination, he said, is an impossible project. We can't do it, even if we try. But assimilation must be done, and he comes up with various specific policy programs by which they can assimilate the whole populace into the Amharic and Christian and imperial culture. And he then prescribes these policy measures for the Ministry of Education, for the military, for all sorts of sectors of state bureaucracy, which have to do the assimilation project. And you already see the fact that Ethiopia is kind of not at peace with itself, or not at peace with the periphery of the empire. And that tension was never resolved. And that tension saw in the constitution of 1931, which basically othered the other peoples of Ethiopia. And if you read through the preambles written by the draftsperson, Teklawariat Teklemariam Teklisha, he, in an attempt to justify why the constitution was needed in the first place, because the nobility then didn't even want a written constitution because they thought this is too westernizing. When he was justifying it, one of the reasons he says that he has to have this kind of law is because Ethiopia has been threatened by its enemies, such as the Oromo, the Falasha, the Muslims, and so on and so forth. So, you just read through it and say, wait. So the enemies of the state. So it clearly defines the diverse forces in the country as the state's others. And in order to make sure that the state comes out strong out of this diversity, this kind of legislation is necessary. And the constitution was meant to unify the people and to modernize the state. So to unify the people and to modernize the state. There is a civilizational mission in there. What does that basically mean? To unify people and to modernize the state is to create a nation state out of the many peoples in the country. So it couldn't bring the resolution that it wanted for the tensions of empire, but it kind of took a gesture towards dissolving the issue, the tension within there. In 1955, when Eritrea was reunited with Ethiopia through a federation, they needed to amend the constitution to make it match up to the Eritrean constitution that was made by the UN, prescribed for them by the UN. And again, they tried to improve upon it, but the tension between the other peoples and the imperial imaginary, the imperial fantasy of Ethiopia remained there. And through other public laws, it was even exaggerated across the years. And by 1960s, by the late 1960s, the students were basically asking questions: who is the Ethiopian? Why do we need other specific trappings in order for us to become Ethiopian? And why are some people less Ethiopian than others? The questions became very clear about identity. Who represents Ethiopia? Who is the Ethiopian, the quintessential Ethiopian, and the less Ethiopian? And those questions became very powerful in the student movement. As you know, in November 1969, Wallerling wrote that article, very provocative and basically asking questions and also taking gestures towards resolving that tension. Of course, from a left perspective, again, he said this is a prison house of nations, and the prison house must be opened, and the way to open it up is through the right to self-determination. That was a very provocative article, and that, I think, was in many ways, it broke the taboo, and many nationalist forces started to analyze Ethiopia's political problems through the national lens. Of course, there was already a class analysis. Now there is the culture analysis tied to the creed analysis, meaning trying to understand Ethiopia's problems from a religious perspective, from a perspective of religious diversity, from the perspective of national diversity, and so on. So by the time it was 1974 and the revolution erupted, these questions have already become mature. But it was soon overwhelmed by the Derg. But even the Derg, in 3 years' time, when they came up with the National Democratic Revolution program after the revolution, they actually came up with the idea of self-determination for nationalities in Ethiopia. And again, that National Democratic Revolution program was said to be drafted by student revolutionaries such as Haile Fida from the All Ethiopian Socialist Movement. But it was already there. The seeds of national self-determination was there during the Derg in the National Democratic Revolution program. And then in 1987, when the Derg had its People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia constitution, Article 2 of the constitution says that the rights of nationalities to self-determination is recognized. But with there is one limitation. The unity and territorial integrity of Ethiopia is inalienable and indivisible. So what it basically is saying is self-determination, internal self-determination is possible. In other words, you will have autonomy regions, autonomy, self-governance, but you will not have cessation because the territorial integrity and national unity of the country is inalienable and indivisible. So it is an indissoluble union, according to the Derg. An indissoluble union within which the nationalities are recognized. One of the things it says is the language and culture of all nationalities is recognized, and there shall be no discrimination on the basis of language, etc., etc. That's what it says. And in fact, even the Derg, in the early days, before it wrote the constitution, they did the basic literacy campaign, the basic literacy campaign in about 13 languages, in about 13 ethnic groups' languages. And it was already there. So I'm trying to say, this is not an artifact, a creation of the TPLF. It wasn't a creation of the OLF or some such nationalist groups. We came up from the periphery and imposed it from above. In fact, it was the mainstream Ethiopianist left politics that framed the subject. The main people such as Andargacho Tsegaye, when today they say this is the Zog politica, etc., and kind of refer to ethnic federalism derisively, it makes me laugh because these were people who were involved in the framing of Ethiopian political problem as partly a national problem. And so it's a little disingenuous to say that this problem has emerged only, popped up in 1991, and that was because TPLF and OLF and some other groups and ONLF, etc., brought it to the table. That's not an accurate description.
By the way, I just want to remind people that it's exactly 52 years ago that Wallerling wrote to the week. This is a week November 17, 1969, he wrote that. Very interesting article, 5 pages. You can find it here, the marxistes.org. That is where I found this. And it's also 26 years to this week, again, when I checked, where Article 39 was actually discussed by the committee and by the assembly. So there are a number of connections. Dr. Tsegaye also graduated just within a couple of months or a month after the constitution was ratified, all that. So the reason we are talking about this is it's a very controversial, I don't know if that's the right term, but it's a very hot potato in terms of when people talk about the politics. People who never read maybe the constitution, specifically if you read, getting ready for this show, I was reading the minutes, the protocol, the minutes taken both by the Constitutional Commission and by the Assembly that approved that. So it was interesting who said what and how it was discussed. All these, options, including, word change, word smithing, or, even putting a condition only when there was a discussion where they say, okay, we can have that article, but put a condition where it's there is oppression that you can talk about, or if there is economic, cultural, and so on. But I think the majority from the committee to the assembly subscribed to the notion that it shouldn't be with any condition. So if you were in your academic position and the lawyer and with the person interested in this, do you remember from your readings or from observation, how was this article treated, in the academia or in the political elites at, around that 94, 90? I mean, the discussion started in 93, I guess.
Yeah.
Then it took a couple of years with all this process and so on. So can you remind our viewers and myself
Right.
what you
I
remember?
think the right of nations to self-determination was first became the paramount, the most important principle in 1991. In July 1991, when they were negotiating the transitional charter, in the charter, Article 2 was basically about self-determination. And they start from the recognition of the UN Declaration of Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a fundamental document that they all subscribe to. The protection of all political freedoms like freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom to form a party, and expression, speech, etc. are guaranteed. Those are the basic rights they recognize. And then they talk about self-determination of nations, nationalities, and peoples. And in that proclamation, in that charter, the right to self-determination is recognized with condition. The conditions are if people, nation, nationality, and people can secede if there is a massive human rights violation, B, if there is a violation of their democratic rights, whatever that means, and C, if there is no other way to correct or redress the problem, the injustice. In these circumstances, the people have the right to determine their destiny by opting out, by stepping out. That's self-determination with condition. Now, as for the discourse, of course, in the discussion on the charter, there wasn't a lot of elaborate discussion. It was a group of national liberation fronts there with the Eritrean government as an observer. It was supposed to be part of it. By June, when they took control of Asmara, Eritrea, in EPLF Asmara, TPLF Addis Ababa, they had agreed that they will come together in a transitional charter, in a meeting, in a conference which negotiates a transitional charter. By the time July came and the transitional charter was negotiated, the Eritrean president said, we have already established our provisional government. We are an observer, we are not part of Ethiopia. And we just come and sit and watch you from the balcony. And that had a lot of disappointment on the part of the TPLF back then. They felt they are betrayed. But anyway, they just went on. And during the discussion, there was some discord, most of it coming from the representative of the Addis Ababa University at the time, Professor Asrat Waldayes, who later on...
May I, because you mentioned about the disappointment of the TPLF vis-a-vis Shabia or EPLF. So can you deepen that? Because maybe that's something that many, including myself, didn't know. So what was the expected TPLF had?
Yeah, you see, they were basically allies and partners during the war.
Yeah. And
they kind of tried to come to an understanding of the problems of Ethiopia in the same way. But they had this difference even from the time of the liberation fight in the north, because Eritrea always saw its situation as very distinct, and it has a different roadmap for the other parts of Ethiopia. But because they were treated by the Derg as one and the same, the Derg basically was looking at TPLF as an appendage, an annex to EPLF, because they are together. And from the perspective of the TPLF, they did the large part of the fighting, the resistance. The larger part, the share of the resistance was done by the TPLF. And so because of this, they kind of see them as comrades and all other national groups as comrades. And they have they think the problem of Ethiopia is the problem of empire, the problem of, nationalism and so on and so forth. But they don't exactly have the same kind of analysis when it comes to the issue of Eritrea. And remember, even Meles has written a book about Eritrea from where to where, so they had this perspective. And yet, because TPLF was always accused of being a mercenary, kind of, working for others, especially the Arabs, for example, who support Eritrea, for example, working for Eritrea to let the country disintegrate. That was the accusation. And they were saying, no, if people decide their destiny, that's what we want. But we do not want Ethiopia to be dismembered. The fact that you are told that we are here to disintegrate, to cause the disintegration of the country, is a state propaganda. So that was the view they were taking to the people. During this, there was, I always say, the first kind of government they established is the Peace and Stability Committee at the local level, because government is local, I suppose. And the first administration they basically had was the Peace and Stability Committee. And whenever they go around villages to do those kinds of things, people ask them, you are going to make Eritrea secede? Yeah? And they say, no, that's not what we do. But if the Eritrean people so want, who are you to stop them? They just engage with every ordinary folk. I was in Mercato, and I remember we stand in it's summer season, so it's rainy season. We just stand, we don't go to school. So we stand and they pass by and they kind of ask us questions. We ask them questions. Why do you want to disintegrate, to cause the disintegration of Ethiopia? I say, no, we don't. And they don't even underestimate any ordinary person. They just sit down with you and talk and talk. The bad thing is, until they convince you, they won't let you go. And so you don't stay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a very lengthy discussion. So because they were saying this, come July, when the conference started, they were hoping Eritrea, as one of the forces that deposed the regime, will sit with them and talk about it and have a shared transitional plan. And Eritrea said, no, I'm out. I have a provisional government. This is your internal business. You guys do it. And yet Ethiopia was deciding in that very moment that there will be a referendum for Eritreans in 2 years. We will have a election towards government forming in Addis Ababa. We will have a referendum in Eritrea in 2 years. So that was the end of it. As for the discourse, and so when Isaias came and said, I'm not going to sit with you guys to talk about your stuff, so that was a huge letdown. It's like, oh. And they were quiet because they have been seen as partners in the eyes of the Ethiopian public, seen as partners in the eyes of their opponent, the Derg, and and in the international community, and they didn't want to disturb that. That's just, and also there is the power dynamics. They don't know exactly how far they can, combat them, so they just let it go. But it was a huge disappointment. It came back. This disappointment came back, and frustration came back when the 1998 border war started, and you will see the tantrums everywhere. And so that was the beginning. But as for the discourses in Ethiopia, the intellectual class of the time did not even talk about it, did not know that there was a constitutional negotiation process. It was a resistance by avoidance. It was basically, it doesn't exist. It didn't exist in the minds. Look, one of the reasons I was maligned when I teach constitutional law is because they think because you teach constitutional law, you are basically a conscript of EPRDF, because they see the constitution as an EPRDF propaganda. I teach human rights. I ask my students to do their thesis topics on human rights, on constitutionalism, and so on and so forth. People think, this EPRDF propaganda is going to be written as a legal thesis. So especially the legal academia was completely ignorant, and it was a strategic ignorance. It was an ignorance which is the result of disdain of what is going on in the public arena. And also, I think the 17 years repression on academic freedom has completely made our legal intellect, our legal minds unimaginative, because the one area of academia that was hard hit by the Derg's totalitarianism is the law school. As you know, in 1974, the American staff, which were about 24 of them, they were asked to leave the country in 48 hours. And the faculty was left with 5 local staff and local junior staff at that time. So the Americans are gone, 5 staff. And the next year, they said law is a tool of the oppressor. So studying law is not necessary. So they actually wanted to close down the law school, the Derg. And then when they opened it, they said it has to be only done for 3 years. Why is it only why is it going to 5 years? And the next time they came, they changed the curriculum, and they infused the Soviet jurisprudence. The document to be read was Afanasiev, and on and on. And so this is when I found out when I do my history, my research on legal education, the history of legal education. So for 17 years, the law faculty was kind of the most hard hit. The legal imagination was so compressed. The ones that graduated before the revolution were conscripted into the Derg. People, you can, Dawit Yohan, what was it? Shalika Dawit Georgis was the lawyer. Branu Baye was the lawyer. Goshualde was the lawyer. You can name them. All of them who graduated before the revolution were conscripted into the revolution. Now they are servants of the revolution. And so they became technocrats within the government. But the academia was left to some junior anonymous folks who were kind of battered, and they just toe their lines. So that was the effect. In fact, in 1995, when the draft constitution was sent to him, a famous Italian legal scholar, Ugo Mattei, looked at it and said, this constitution shows the fact that legal scholarship in Ethiopia is impoverished. In fact, this is an example of cultural imperialism imposed on Ethiopia. Ironically, he says, on a country that was non-colonized. And what that tells you is that constitutional legal discourse, the constitutional legal scholarship was very poor. In fact, the constitution was born into a legal scholarship void. There was no legal scholarship that could handle it. And the law school was completely ignorant of it. The one exception was Andreas Schete, who came from abroad, who was an outsider looking in to the faculty. And he never had an office. He was sitting on, in front of the law faculty's building on a stone when he converses with his students. He was the only one who was following up the public life of the country as a lawyer should. And later, of course.
Did he have a law background, or he was in philosophy, right? Or
he was in political philosophy and legal philosophy, so he has been teaching those subjects in the West. And when he came, he was a professor of jurisprudence. In 1995, on our graduation ceremony, he was actually honored at the university. He was a convocation speaker. And then he was appointed as a professor of jurisprudence, but he never had an office until he became president, mind you. He was not even given an office at the law school. He sat in front of the law school when he converses with his students. So he was the only one, because he had Inter-Africa Group, which was also heavily involved in the process of constitution drafting. And he was the only one that was really following on what is going on in terms of law in the area of the public life. So with that exception, the time of the constitution drafting, the charter, the time when the rights of self-determination, the human rights issues was deliberated publicly, the law school was unaware, totally unaware of what's going on. Part of the reason is a strategic ignorance out of disdain. Part of the reason is the historical fear of coming close to the state, because they had this fear in the past that they were towing their line, and to come close is to be a Derg member. And now they just said, no, we just stick here. So because of that, the legal scholarship was very, very impoverished. Across the university setting, the idea of self-determination was under-theorized. The whole concept, the law was completely under-theorized. It was even under-historicized. That's why until today, you hear people saying, this is a Stalinist transplant here, and so on and so forth. It doesn't speak to the history of how it was made. And when you go to the minutes and how the discussion unfolded, you see there is a rich discourse there, even playing with words. But because it is under-theorized in the intellectual realm, even in historical terms, Ethiopia is known to be a country that is suffering from the burden of history a lot. And any intellectual life that existed is basically an intellectual life of the historian in Ethiopia. If you Ethiopian studies, the universities, fine arts, and social science is generally about history. The north is an area of historians. The south is the area of ethnologists and anthropologists. History is very much important, and culture is very much important. When it comes to public law, public life, politics, history, and culture, the one thing Ethiopians have as a resource is not deployed, and it is under-theorized, under-analyzed. And that was a problem. So by the time I was going to the law school, nobody talks about it. We just watch the TV discussions in the evening. Because the debate on the constitutional text was live televised every evening. And for an hour, we sit through it and we listen to that. And in the next day, when we go to classes, we raise some of the issues in our classes. So we had a very, very incapable teacher, but who created a good forum for us to discuss constitutional law. Our constitutional law teacher was a lazy person who came to class only about 3 days throughout the semester. But one of the things that he did is he asked us to create a government, a Senate, a Congress, a House of Representatives, a government, a speaker, and all those things, and so that we debate. And what he just said, for him to have more time not to come to class, became a thing that we enjoyed. We became a government, seriously. We took roles. We became senators, speakers, ministers, and so on and so forth. We had impeachment programs and everything. And without knowing, while we were playing the roles, we became knowledgeable about the Constitution. We go and read everything there is to know about those roles. And so the guy didn't know, we became actually knowledgeable on the subject. And we also started to watch what is going on in Parliament. So other than that, there wasn't a lot of literature. There wasn't anything. In fact, the literature that emerged after the adoption of the Constitution used a language that is not becoming to the text. The text talks about the national right to self-determination. The literature that came, it talks about ethnic federalism. The word ethnic federalism, the whole concept is Western. This one is more from the left, and it was basically homegrown, Nations and Nationalities and Peoples. It comes from the Institute of National Studies archive. They had studied it during the Derg. It's the Derg that studied the charisma. People think it is the Wayane creation, but it was the Derg that created this map, this ethno-linguistic map in the Institute of Nationalities Studies, way before the EPRDF arrived. And they just used that and used it to create the federal map. So
actually on that point, I have heard, mainstream, quote unquote, Ethiopian media saying the map, actually, the ethnic, they call it map, was an Italian colonial map. So they say Italy made these ethnic divisions to dismember, Ethiopia and so on. But before, answering or reflecting on that, because you reminded me of the TV, the evenings, all that. So it's not a quality video, but just a brief play of the discussion at that time on the flag, on the article related to the Ethiopian flag. Just a flavor of what it looked like at that time.
መስቀል ከደቡብ ህዝቦች ክልል ከወላይታ ብሔረሰብ በአንቀጽ 3 ላይ ማቅረብ የሚፈልገው ሐሳብ በተራ ቁጥር 1 ላይ የተጠቀሰው የኢትዮጵያ ሰንደቅ ዓላማ ከላይ አረንጓዴ ከመሃል ቢጫ ከታች ቀይ ነው። ሶስቱም ቀለማት እኩል ሆነው በአግድም ይቀመጣሉ ነው የሚለው። እኔ በዚህ አቀማመጥ ላይ ብዙ ችግር የለኝም። ነገር ግን ችግሩ ያለው ይችላል ሁሉም ግን ጨርቆች ናቸው። ሁሉም ከጥጥ የተሰሩ ወይንም ከሌላ በዛን ጊዜ የነበረውን ስርዓት ነጥለናለን። ጨርቁ ዓለም የገረፈን በተመለከተ አባቶቻችን ሰራቸው የተባሉ ሶስቱ ቀለማት በአግድም የተቀመጡት እኩል ተቀምጠው ነጭ ቀለምን ተደርቦባቸው ይቀመጡ ይሻላል እላለሁ። ፕላስ በእንበለም ከትራንዚሽናል ከሄድ ይችላል isagana bartamaha la geliyo si naftayuhu de wax cusub waxa uu yahay inuu qarto waana ka baxaysan በአሁኑ ጊዜ የኢትዮጵያ የሽግግር መንግስት አርማ የሆነው በመሃል ሆኖ ነፍጠኞች እንግዲህ አዲስ ነገር መኖሩን እንዲያውቁት ይረዱልን። አመሰግናለሁ። ወጣጣው ነገር ቢተፈጠሩ ነበር ወነቲን ፕሮጀክት ተነሳን ከዚህ በፊት የተፈጸመው ነገር ዋና መሰለኝ ይሄን አይደል ዋብየከነ ሁላችንም ፍላጎት ሁላችንም አንድነት የሚያንጸባርቅ ምልክት ብደረ
I just want to show, how it was deliberated on and so on. One thing that I want to, I was fascinated by when I was looking at the minutes of that assembly, Article 39, there is 60 pages of, who said what, and what was the answer, and the majority and minority from the committee, and how even the minority, I think one person, the committee was led by the late Dr. Abdul Majid Hussein from Somali region, and they documented everything in terms of that article, who said what from which region and what was the reason and how that was decided, all that. So I encourage everyone, to read that because it's available online as well. So you can reflect on, because there is nothing, the phrase ethnic federalism is not in the constitution, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can reflect on
Yes.
what we done.
Very briefly, yes. I think the map, as I said, was basically drawn from the archives of the Institute of Nationality Studies. And the Institute of Nationality Studies was established earlier during the life of the Derg, 7 years before the adoption of the constitution. Its main task was to study the country and prepare a constitution that suits everyone. And in order to do that, they established an expert body, which gathered in what later became the building of the National Electoral Board, just below the Swedish embassy, the premises of the Swedish embassy. And in that institute, they basically sat down, did ethno-linguistic studies, ethnography, anthropologists were there, historians were there, all sorts of people, geographers were there, and they studied them. And social psychologists were there. Professor Yusuf is an example. And they studied that, and in fact, they proposed to the government what kind of regions, what kind of administrative units must be created. And in fact, the Mengistu himself used to chair some of their meetings, and he is the one who, in the end, overruled the implementation of that map in terms of, in the way it is now. Instead, he said in the constitution, as you know, some of the the areas where there is an explosive conflict, Eritrea, Tigray, Ogaden, in these areas, we will give them, he said, an autonomous self-governing regions. Eritrea is one. The Assab region, as you know, Assab was separated from Eritrea. Tigray, third, and then the Ogaden, fourth. And there was, I think, one area which is a self-governing autonomous administrative region, and the rest were simply broken down into the usual Kufla Hagar. So that was vetoed, and that was basically the idea presented by the experts, people like Professor Lapiso de Lebo, Professor Fasil, Dr. Fasil Nahom, were some of the prominent constitutional drafters also, even during the transition time to draft the FDRE constitution. So the idea was basically the result of not even ideologues of the socialist regime. It was just experts, linguists, ethnographers, geographers, historians, cartographers, and so on and so forth. They came together and said, this is the pattern, and this is what we think. And Mengistu vetoed it personally. And they said, just to make sure that we can satisfy some of the irredentist movements, in his words, in Eritrea and Tigray and Ogaden, will give them self-governing status. Assab, in part because they wanted to have the access to the sea thing, and they wanted to separate it from Eritrea. So, and also the Afar hinterland is also a resistant area. It's never wanted to be assimilated into the Ethiopian, the Ethiopian polity. So, as a gesture also to recognize their autonomous, outrageously autonomous mindset, he granted that autonomy. Other than that, everything went on as it is. But even then, the constitution, as I said earlier, recognizes the right of nationalities to self-determination, i.e. in the form of internal self-determination. What happened in 1991, between 1992 and 1994, was interesting because the charter said there will be a constitutional drafting commission to be established very soon and to work on a constitution. And accordingly, in 1992, they established a constitutional drafting commission. And Kifle Wadaje was the chair, and about 20-something members were there, and experts were there from all sides. And the Constitutional Drafting Commission was established in 1992. Just before the the Constitutional Drafting Commission was established, there was also National Regional Self-Governance Proclamation number 7, 1992, that was issued in order to decentralize power from the Derg time to give expression, administrative expression, to the different groups that were negotiating the transitional charter. So the Proclamation number 7, 1992 was already drawn on the basis, which is basically more or less the map we have now, on the basis of the map established and put in the map prepared by the National Studies Institute. When the drafting commission was established, its house was the premises, the building of, again, the nationalities studies. So the drafting commission met in that same house, in that same building, and sat down to draft the constitution. So when it did, it looks into its own archive history. It listens to the statements by the leaders of the time, the people who negotiated the transitional charter, which are mainly national liberation fronts, and it drafts it on the base, using the language of those archives and the statements by the politicians. It never used the term ethnic federalism. It's very disingenuous to say that this was a deliberate conspiracy to divide and disintegrate Ethiopia in a fascist colonial manner because they drew on the fascist map, etc. And to be sure, there is some kind of similarity, a very, very remote similarity. And the similarity is this. Eritrea was part of the Ethiopian, the Italian colony, separate. And they wanted to divide the other areas. There was the kingdom of Galla and Sidama in the south. That's how they created it. And then there is the Hausa and the Afar. And then there is the western periphery, which was, some of it was part of Sudan. And these were the kinds of governance structures that the Italians had created. But that they weren't unaware of the divides, the cleavages. They were aware, and they had their political reasons, because they saw that the hinterland of the Abyssinian Empire is where the resistance is coming from. So they wanted to counteract that by saying there are other people who are opposing those things. And let's not forget that by 1936, just after the Italians came to Ethiopia, the Western Oromo Confederation was established. And they sent their members, their representatives, to the League of Nations to be recognized as a separate state, or to fall under the British protectorate rather than fall under the Italian colonial administration. So that was the 1936 Western Oromo Confederation, which was already established. And so you can see the divide already. So the Italians weren't really creating it. They were reading the cleavages on the ground, and they were kind of using it opportunistically, of course, and they were started. So there is some parallel, some remote similarity between the map then, because it gives expression to the ethnic distinct identity, to the extent that it does, and to the extent that the current map gives expression to the distinct identities. There is, of course, some resonance, but it is not exactly the same, and it is not that map that was used in 1992 or in 1995. So they created their own criteria. How do we create states? They said we have to look at language, settlement pattern, identity, and above all, the consent of the peoples concerned. This is in Article 46. This is what you see in the Constitution. This is also what you see in the Charter. in the preceding charter. So these 4 criteria were put into the as a criteria of state formation: language, identity, settlement pattern, and consent of the people concerned. And when people say it's only linguistic criteria that was taken into account, I don't think they know what they're talking about. How is it linguistically the southern region is one and the same? Gambela is one and the same. Tigray is one and the same, because everywhere you see diversity in terms of linguistics. If it was the linguistic criteria that was exclusively used, we wouldn't have the map that we have. We wouldn't have only 9 states. So it's a bit disingenuous, really, to say that. One thing one should say is the reason they ethnicize it when there is no ethnic federalism is to undermine it. And by the way, Article 39 and the right to self-determination has taken so much unnecessary political energy, and people have spent so much unnecessary political energy, so much so that it is now a blinder to any political action in that country. Otherwise, the question of self-determination is conceived, at least by the drafters, as problem solver. It is a way of resolving historic contradiction. And it is a way of governance. That's all it is. But the ills of Ethiopia are further than that. But self-determination is a blinder, which really consumed unnecessary political energy, and it became the rallying point at which, with which to delegitimize the EPRDF regime, and even today delegitimize the voices of diversity. And that's why the same provision, the same principle of self-determination is still the area around which Abiy's forces are mobilized. And even after the arch enemy, in their view, TPLF, is removed from power, they are always talking about changing the constitution, repealing Article 39, and amending the federal arrangement, changing the federal arrangement, and even changing the national emblem, the national anthem, the national, the working language of the country. They say the national language in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a multinational country, therefore you can't have a national language. You can have a working language, or you can have many national languages. And people talk about today, even Abiy's regime, immediately after establishing his new government, just this past few months ago, immediately after that, one of the things he proposed, and there was I think a policy document discussed within the party, was to have a national dialogue with opposition parties, and then immediately embark on a constitutional amendment towards creating a consensus on national language, on national anthem, national emblem, and so on and so forth. So all those things show you that there is this phrase that long stayed here to consume the political energy of the country in their effort to delegitimize EPRDF and TPLF. And it is still being used to kind of disparage the TPLF era and whatever TPLF represents now, whatever ethno-nationalist forces represent now. And for me, however, in fact, Article 39 is the one provision that takes the sting of violence out of that country's political system. In my view,
let me, I'm glad you are mentioning that, but I just want to dwell a bit on, or to show something on what you talk about, disingenuous, talking about the very core interest in terms of, just in terms of consistency. If we just listen to what Taye Selassie said on August 26, he, the UN ambassador, Ethiopian ambassador to the UN in New York, and he talks about how the problem, the current problem, the war, is not about November 4th, 2020. He talks about 1991. Maybe this is time to play that.
State of affairs in Ethiopia did not transpire overnight. They were in the making long before the TPLF unleashed attack on the northern command of the NDF in the dark hours of November 4. The genesis of the current conflict goes back at least 3 decades ago. Since 1991, TPLF maintained hegemonic control over the political, security, and economic life of the Ethiopian people.
So this is his speech at the UN Security Council discussing Ethiopia, Tigray, all that. And who is Tsegaye Ararssa? He was, as you can see here, number 8 of the Constitutional Commission, the Constitution Drafting Commission, and specifically had a role as well as the head of the Public Relations Service of the Constitutional Commission. So I think this is a kind of poster child of what you were mentioning about, you know. Yeah, so I just want you to reflect on that.
Yeah, I think these forces are trying to litigate history. There is this coming back to mourn over the defeat of empire in 1991. They basically are rejecting the defeat of 1991, the defeat of imperial politics, the defeat of an idea, the defeat of a model of nation building that they have been pursuing for ages. And they have been trying to say that defeat was not conclusive, and we are back, and we are going to litigate that history, and we are going to say, it was like 27 years, time froze, and they are just resuming. They are taking, resuming action now, as if in between it wasn't a defeat. It was just it froze.
A timeout.
Yes,
yeah.
A timeout, and that's very always it's surprising to me. But the reason is because the sting of violence didn't come out, in part because the promise of self-determination was not delivered. The self-determination was recognized. It was suspended. It was almost this. It remained a promise, giving lots of hope to people, but never getting there fundamentally because of the democratic process in the government system throughout. And the periphery hangs on the hope, but still is disenchanted because it's continuing to aspire for what, determination of their destiny. The center rejects the defeat and is happy that the promise is not delivered. And they were waiting to strike to undo the promise, because the promise itself is a threat to them. The promise tells the story that their time is gone, that they have been defeated. Their idea of the model of nation building they pursued has no place in this country. So it's a way of getting back to the discourse and saying it didn't fall, it didn't collapse. That nation building model is still here, and it was unduly pushed out of the political discourse, but it is still here. That's what they are trying to say. I didn't know this ambassador was part of the constitution drafting process. It's so surprising to me that this same guy comes back to tell us that the problem started in 30 years ago. In fact, he precisely makes our point elsewhere, that the war didn't start on November 4, and they were trying to attack Tigray, to relitigate history, and to attack them for what they have done some years ago, not for what they actually did, as they say, by attacking the Northern Division on November 3. So it's very interesting that they are saying this. But coming back to this point of self-determination, having the potential to remove the sting of violence out of the state system, but also having the fact that it hasn't been delivered, it's remained a promise. I think that's what we need to discuss. And as I said, our legal scholarship is impoverished, and there is no constitutional legal writing in many years now. All there is a tinkering with technique here and there, but there is no systematic interpretation of the Constitution in the light of its history, in the light of the problems it addresses, in the light of the potential for peacemaking, the potential for lasting peace, etc., etc. But I think it is a way of addressing the problems on the ground and also giving some guarantee for a lasting peace. What do I mean by that? Ethiopia is an empire state built by violence. And I'm not the only one who says this. There are a host of studies telling us that the Horn of Africa in general is a frontier of violence. And Richard Reed wrote a book in 2011, 2012, entitled The Frontiers of Violence. These states are states created, constituted, and maintained by violence. And Ethiopia is one of those states in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia is a multinational, constituted as a multinational empire who wanted to create a nation state out of the many entities. And in the process, it brought about lots of devastation on lives and created lots of political demands, political questions, questions for seeking to be addressed, questions of justice, questions of equality, questions of freedom, self-determination. And those had to be responded to in some ways. And the only way to respond to them is democratically. And self-determination does two things. One, and the way it is recognized in the Constitution. Now remember, in the Charter, it was a conditional right. In the Constitution, it is not conditional anymore. You don't need to experience a massive human rights violation. You don't need to experience a trampling upon of your democratic rights. You don't need to have no way of redressing correcting the problem. If you feel like going, you can. That's what it says. And what it does, the Constitution does, is it establishes a procedure. It establishes a procedure for walking out. But by doing so, it makes it a routine legal practice. Now, self-determination is not a political issue anymore. It is a legal matter, which means you don't have to invest so much political energy in it. You don't have to pick up arms for it. That's what it means. When it is legally recognized, procedure is established, institutions are put in place, it means it is beyond political debate. In fact, you will be surprised why it is being politicized when it is beyond politics now. It is in the law. To politicize the law for critical reasons, I understand, but it is in fact the most conservative thing you do is to invoke the Constitution to argue against or argue for self-determination. But why is it recognized and put in such a way that it is routinized? So it means if you have a right to self-determination claim, then you will have to table it and go through the procedures under Article 39 sub 4, where whatever has to be done, meaning you'll have to have a local council that votes, that gives you a 2/3 majority vote of approval of the independence. Then you will have to present it to the House of Federation. Then the House of Federation must organize a referendum for you in a matter of 3 years. And then after the referendum, you have to have a majority vote of support for the independence. Then you will have to do what is called the liquidation of assets. And then you will go your own ways. That is a peaceful dissolution of membership in the Federation, which means you don't have to pick up arms. You don't have to overly exercise politically. It's just a legal procedure. It's like if someone is accused of some crime and his case is pending in court, you don't exercise yourself with it. You just you move on and do your thing. And when the process comes to whatever it comes to, the decision comes. That's all it is. And in Ethiopia, unnecessary political energy is consumed and wasted on an article on a subject matter that should have been giving us some rest and assurance. The reason this has a potential for a lasting peace is because in order to achieve self-determination, you don't have to pick up arms. One. And secondly, in order to, it also lets you, it gives you some guarantee about what is to happen in case you want to go, which means you will have time to think about it, to do politics around it, to convince each other, persuade each other, change course, and go out to the public and convince people against it, people for it, And ultimately, it means the people decide, not the political elite, not a political party, not an armed gang. No one can decide. So one of the things that it does is it actually takes people seriously. It puts people at the center of political decision. So the elite is disabused of the privilege of speaking on behalf of the people. And this is what it does. And this is absolutely important for Ethiopia because it brings about a lasting peace and it makes the elite free of the anxiety, as I always say, the Amhara establishment class, the elite have this Amhara anxiety that Ethiopia will be dismembered if Article 39 is there, as if the article is the cause. In fact, the article actually routinizes it. It makes it very procedural. It makes it a legal matter. And once a thing is a legal matter, it doesn't have a political expediency. That's what they miss all the time. If it is a legal matter, then it is even worse than election, Election is more volatile than referendum and self-determination. This is what it promises. And I don't think people have understood it. I don't think the energy that is wasted around it is analytic. People don't analyze it. They simply slogan around it. There is a lot of sloganeering around it, and that's what is actually bedeviling all the political discourse in Ethiopia. And of course, there is this disparaging of peoples as treasonous, betraying the country if you invoke this article, and that's why they bring in the Italian colonial project as the forerunner of this project, and on and on. I don't think that's I think a misplaced emphasis, to be honest. If you ask me, as a lawyer, it's a misplaced emphasis in our politics, and that's unfortunate.
Maybe we will go to the end of the show in terms of, is it increasing in terms of the demand, the quest, and so on? But before that, I'm showing this how the draft that came from these 20 plus members of the drafting commission to the assembly, which is now, I think, then 544 or so in the peoples of, I think, the people who were elected there. So there were 10 committees with 11 members each. And one of the committees was Committee of Rights of Nations and Nationalities. It was chaired by Dr. Abdul Majid Hussein from Somalia. And then you could see number 5, the Mokonnen, who is now the acting prime minister. Can we call him? At least based on the Wikipedia update, it's updated into acting prime minister. So then you see some people like Mulgeta Gabrahewat, who is now he's a professor, but he's in the TDF. Major Admas is a Leka, the late Admas is a Leka, who was famous in the TV at that time in terms of asking questions that were, at least in the committee, a minority, I must say. So he was representing Addis Ababa or region region 14. This is a type. So these were the people who were drafting, arguing, and presenting, and so on. So the 60 pages of minutes of the meeting at that time was chaired by Dr. Abdul Majid Hussein.
Yeah.
So the question of Dr. Tsegaye, the question of, is it now after Abiy came to power, they imposed Article 39 or the constitution, everything, and is gone, and suddenly people are for one Ethiopia, no ethnic division, nothing, and then go for even maybe what could look like a presidential system, all that. That's the rhetoric we have been hearing the last 3 years. So what is your assessment of, and I mean, to their credit, or in their defense, you can see that, for example, what was unleashed on Tigray, people felt was only on Tigray. Everyone is siding with the prime minister, and again as this troublemaker in the north. So is that not like the reading that we should take, and trust these people who say the self-determination? Yes, it was there. People were celebrating for, let's say, 27 years, and then the real feeling of the being Ethiopian came. So what is your argument, in terms of dispelling this rhetoric?
I think most people, to be honest, they don't even understand, they don't know these facts because they never look closely at what was transpiring in those days. And most people feel they are excluded. TPLF concocted everything. This is a TPLF fabrication, nothing more, nothing less. And you see the arduous work that was involved. And if you look at the list of these 11 members, in that list, you can only see one person representing TPLF, which is Mulgeta Jaltu. The rest are from other places. From where? From Anywa. I think David Ukumer is probably from where? Not Anywa. I think there is, and then, from all other places. And it's very interesting that the chair of this committee is, in fact, a Somali person, Abdul Majid. And when people say it's a TPLF document, etc., it always makes me, that at best is inaccurate, for God's sake. And the reason they say this is, of course, deliberate. It's a strategic ignorance. They don't know, and they don't want to know, because strategically, knowing doesn't help. So it is a strategic ignorance imposed upon themselves to deny any legitimacy to the federalist dispensation. And the reason they push it, reduce it down to a TPLF artifact is also because it is a minority that is supporting it. That's the message they want to send. But in actual fact, you will see all these peripheral peoples represented there and passionately arguing in the video that you just showed about the flag and how they resent the Ethiopian flag of the historical times is palpable. In fact, it was way beyond political reason. It's so emotional, it's so visceral, the rejection of that flag. And the folks that basically reduce the federalist dispensation into a simple TPLF artifact is a deliberate reduction of it to delegitimize it. And that, I think, is useless. Now, as for the rhetoric, suddenly people became Ethiopian. Well, no, they have been so throughout. They were kicked out of power, the Derg at least, but they continued to use the media. They inhabited the mediascape, the media space. For a long time, opposition media was basically run by former Derg majors. I can mention Tomar, Saif Nebelbal, all sorts of media outlets. Most of them were basically run by people who were Derg soldiers, who were demobilized, and who had nothing else to do. And given the fact that the country wasn't very democratic, and freedom of information wasn't there, and freedom of expression is curtailed, makes them keep turning these opinion pieces filled with conspiracy theories, and they are always there. And for the last 27 years, they were basically shaping and molding this opinion that you see now, and becoming very hostile against the other peoples of Ethiopia. They were there. You see, of course, to the extent freedom of expression was constrained, they were also constrained. But also constraining freedom of speech doesn't help sometimes. It makes the anger explosive. The resentment was going on and on and on. And it was made there for a long time. And in the aftermath of the Oromo protest, in the eve of this change, when the Oromo protest was raging, the argument coming from the other side, the anti-Oromo argument coming from the other side, was basically very powerfully against this basically what has come about after Abiy came to power. And over the years, it's not just the media outlets, the cultural medium also, the songs, music. It was a season of quietly rehabilitating empire. The icons of imperial times were rehabilitated in the songs of Teddy Afro, in the songs of, and the idea of this expansionist attitude, the claim of Wolkite, the claim of Raya, these things were in the songs. The Mera was singing Arasut, you hear them long time ago. This idea was formed elsewhere, outside of the political space. But it was a powerful, poignant, popular attitude. It is that popular attitude that is unleashing itself now to express itself in the form of anti-Tigrayan sentiment, anti-Oromo sentiment. In 2018, when they were killing Keros and Karres that were coming to welcome the OLF in Finfinne, there was this extraordinary anger and hatred, looking at the Kero and Karre as the monsters. And people were feeling free to go out and kill them. And hotels to remove them from where they had booked, and they were booked, and they were in the middle of the night, they were dragged down to the street and they were beaten in September 2018. And what we saw expressed after the war started in Tigray was what we have been seeing at the time of the welcoming of the OLF and the OMN into Ethiopia. It wasn't just the Tigrayan. In fact, Tigray is doubly attacked because vicariously it also represents the others, because it's Tigray that brought the others into the center. There is a natural anti-Tigrayan sentiment, but also anti-Tigrayan sentiment for the others. So I sometimes say it is a vicarious responsibility that they carry also. It was seen like they are the ones that are strengthening and bringing the others back to the center, and so on and so forth. So you would see this, and it was there in the cultural space. It was inhabiting the cultural social space. And people begin to be surprised today. They say, who were we living with, really? How can they be so mean and point fingers at us so that we can be victims of ethnic cleansing and dragged to concentration camps? You should have listened to the music. You should have listened to the media. You should have read their papers. You should have listened to the FM programs everywhere in the city, how they look at the other. And it wouldn't be surprising when you know that. And when we were so critical of those things over the years, it was like, these enemies of Ethiopia, these monsters are trying to emphasize their ethnic parochial attitude, and whatever we talk about in terms of national glory is is bad to you, and so on and so forth. That was where the violence is packed and contained, but the violence now found an expression through Abiy, who mounts that anger and resentment for his own reason. He doesn't side with them. In fact, he's ideologically empty, totally empty. He can ride any other ideology that can help him keep the space, the power position. But he actually exploited it, manipulated it, and he galloped it, and he lost, not because of the lack of strength of that attitude, but because it is, in terms of politics, implausible, untenable. It's not going us anywhere. In fact, the comeback of Ethiopia's imperial politics with its expansionist urges, with its assimilationist urges, with its genocidal urges, the coming back actually showed spectacularly that playing with that idea will only lead you to war, and to a war that is actually brutal and genocidal. And it is I think, a very conclusive statement about how the nation building project that does not recognize the right of peoples to self-determination is anachronistic, is implausible, is unworkable in Ethiopia. And in fact, it is a recipe for war. And going forward, I think now, because of the coming back of the imperial politics, people are actually saying it's over. We want the promise of self-determination to be real. So in terms of talking about self-determination in the future, I think that's the only road to go, and it was the least traveled road for the last 30 years. And I think it is going to happen. And I know in the roadmap of the TDF and the OLA, Oromo Liberation Army TDF agreement framework, and in the roadmap for the post-Abiy transition, one of the things that they are planning for is to come up with a referendum act, which also establishes a referendum commission and establishes a procedural set of norms with which to table and implement a referendum towards exercising the right to self-determination, both at the at station level, but also at statehood level. As you know, there are several demands for statehood, especially from the peoples who were in what is so far known as the Southern Nations and Nationalities and Peoples Regional State. And there are demands for recognition of distinct identity and the right to existence, as, for example, is seen among the peoples of Kamant, Ago, Konso, Garashe, and so on and so forth, and Gofa, and so on and so forth, and Donga in the Kambata zone, and so on. And then there is the right to self-determination, the outstanding question of the Ogaden, the ONLF, the Oromo, which is now spearheaded by the Oromo Liberation Army, because at the end of peaceful political exercise comes a military political process. And now the OLA is mounting its operations against Finfinne, and at the moment they capture the city, they will establish a provisional government in Oromia and across the country, along with other members of the United Front. And they said, actually, without addressing the demands for self-determination, we can never get an effective transition to democracy, and we can also not get security for a lasting peace. So one of the things that we do is to show that there is a political will, a political determination to at least address the question in some form. And the way to show that determination is to table the matter, the agenda, and to create a referendum law, to create a referendum and institution commission, and to set down the procedural steps to be taken. And that means to draw a timeline for giving people the expression, the self-expression towards self-determination. That's the roadmap. And the future, therefore, will be, number one, undoing the excesses of imperial politics in its expansionist form, in its genocidal form, in its repressive form, assimilative form. Once and for all, it will be dealt with, meaning realizing the promises of self-determination as it was recognized in the Constitution. That's one. The second is to take the sting of violence out of it and make the people decide. In order to do that, these forces, of course, cannot decide. What they can do is to table it, to prepare a legal and institutional and procedural framework, and also with that assurance that people will have the opportunity to determine their destiny, now you can fully trust each other as you negotiate a transition towards a democratic dispensation. So these are the three things that they are trying to establish in the roadmap. And I think the future of self-determination in Ethiopia will be tied to democratization, peace building, consolidation, and of course, curtailing the excesses of imperial ambitions, such as the one that was mounted by Abiy Ahmed to lead to a genocidal war.
Actually, that's I was about to ask you about how you see the future playing out, and I'm glad you mentioned about the roadmap and what's in it in relation to self-determination, making it concrete and implementing it without any condition. But I would be happy if we can talk about specifically the roadmap and what is in the making or what has been done so far, all that in a separate show. But today I am very happy that we could cover this. For me, it was a learning experience in terms of the preparation itself, but also in the insights that you gave us from your experience, your academic career, as well as your public square contributions, interventions, all that. Maybe I want to just, I was showing this while you were talking, but this is again the total of at that time when all the discussions, the televised discussions that took, the nation watching on the TV, there were 545 of them. Everyone signed here. And among them, the prominent figures in the war on Tigray, all that, very close to the prime minister. You could see here on number 152, Ato Dammaqe Mokonnin Hassan from Bure, signing this Article 39 and everything else. And you could see here on number 112, Ato Geddo Andargacho Allene from Dalanka, who is also the security, I think right now, national security advisor of the prime minister, and so on. So there were 136 people from Amhara region, in signing up, all that and so on. So I think what I see missing, I mean, it's always saddening feeling is the fact that there is a detachment from the elite and the people. If you look at the war, if you look at all this political rhetoric, all that, the genocidal and anything in between, always what these elites call their social base is at the receiving end of all these atrocities and poverty, you name it. So we hope, like you mentioned, the democratization of everything in terms of not on paper, not in terms of saying it, but in terms of really taking it to the people, to the local level, will hopefully curtail any potential of these genocidal and massacres on the people of Ethiopia. Thank you so much for your time for today, and this is to be continued.
Thank you. You have been very generous with your time. I have been given a long time, and thank you for your patience, and thank you for your kindness.
I enjoyed every bit of that. Thank you, Dr. Tsegaye Ararssa. You have been following UMD Media's special show on self-determination in Ethiopia, past, present, and future. My guest was Dr. Tsegaye Ararssa. And as I said, tomorrow we will have a live interview with Ned Price, who is the spokesperson of U.S. State Department. We'll be talking about what has been happening in the region in terms of diplomacy, solving the war, all that. And on Thursday, I will have Mastawal Taddese Gara በፕሮፌሽናል ኤቲክስ በተመለከተ እና የትግራይ ጦርነት ከጀርመን ከሌሎችም ልምዶች ወስደን የኢትዮጵያም የቅርብ ጊዜ ታሪኮች ፕሮፌሽናሎች በተለይ የህግ ሰዎች ምን ያደረጉ እንደነበረ በተመለከተ በበጎ የሚነሱም እናነሳለን። አሁን ያለንበትም ደግሞ እንዳሳለን። ማስተዋል የህግ ባለሙያ ነች። ከአሁን በፊት ወደ የምዲ ሚዲያ መታ ጥሩ ውይይት አድርገን ነበረ። ቅሳነት ኃይሌ ኣብ እንዳ ገብረ ህይወት ፃርሒት ገብርያ ምስ ቅሳነት ብትግርኛ ኣብ መደበኛ ኣብ እንዳ ገብረ ህይወት ዕላል ክንገብር ኢና ሎም መዓንቲ እዚ መስል ነይሩ። Thank you for following us, and please subscribe, share, like, so that YouTube can share with many other with many more in terms of what we do on EMG Media. For today, that was the show. Bye for now.